The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister Jason Hart.
The question was asked at the very beginning of Isaiah chapter 53, to whom was the arm of the Lord revealed? The arm of the Lord, the outstretched arm of the Lord, or we may think of that same figure as the righteous right hand of God, only by which that we ourselves may be saved, to be lifted up by His righteous right hand, taking upon in His hand our own strength and honor, that is, we surrender our right hand unto Him. As we look at the figure of the arm of the Lord, even going all the way back into Exodus chapter 3, as God describes for Moses in Exodus 3, and then Exodus chapter 6, and throughout the plagues that were in Egypt, how God described how He would stretch out His arm against Egypt with many signs and wonders. And many times throughout the Old Testament, whenever you see the children of Israel being delivered by God, it was by an outstretched arm or by His right hand. God's work was being accomplished. Judgment was being carried out for the purpose of bringing deliverance. As we look into the final week of Jesus' life, we see the arm of the Lord stretch out for your salvation and for mine, for judgment against sin and for our deliverance from it. And that heavy right hand, perhaps we see no greater weight of it than as Jesus began to experience it as He entered into the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew that His time was to come very soon. He had told His disciples before that He must suffer at the hands of men. Even though their desire was for Jesus to remain with them forever, they kept wanting to know, where are you going? We want to be able to be with you. Lord, be it far from you. And Jesus knew that His hour had come. Even being troubled in His spirit, He began to question, John chapter 12, should I even ask that I could be taken away from this hour? Moving into John chapter 13, as Jesus begins to get down on His knees with a towel wrapped around His waist and to wash His disciples' feet, John tells us that He knew that His hour had come. And that's the reason why He did that. And then when we look through the conversation that Jesus had between Himself and the disciples in the upper room, Jesus was always pointing them to the fact, my time is about to come. I'll only be with you for a short period of time. Unless I go, I cannot send the Comforter to you. I go to prepare a place for you. And when we come to John chapter 18, we see Jesus. He's with His disciples in the upper room, and they then travel through the streets of Jerusalem eventually to the Temple Mount, where they walk down the Temple Mount into the Kidron Valley, crossing the brook that has been stained by the blood of thousands of sacrificial lambs, when Jesus Himself, the very next evening, the very next day, would become the Passover Lamb, against whom the arm of the Lord would be revealed. And after crossing the brook, He has began to ascend the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, John chapter 18 and verse 4 tells us that Jesus knew all things that would come upon Him. All of the trials, all of the bitter treatment, the rejections, the betrayal, the mockings and the beatings, the scourging. As John mentioned in his thoughts before the communion, how he was spat upon, how he was mocked, how he was nailed to the cross. All of the trials, all the persecutions that he would experience, Jesus was fully aware of every single detail of what would occur to him. Nothing would be missed. That's something when we look into the gospel records that none of the gospel recorders, none of the writers fail to grasp. As a matter of fact, it seems as if they go out of their way to display the omniscience of the Son of God, that He would know all things that were to come upon Him. And yes, Jesus knew it all. And as He walks up the Mount of Olives, it's almost as if you know that the weight of God's right arm is now coming upon Him. By the time He reaches the top and He comes into the garden to pray, He falls down to His knees in exasperation. The weight is too great. If there's ever a moment in time where we see Jesus' complete humanity, it is here in the garden. As Jesus was completely God in some way that is beyond our comprehension of being able to understand, God in the fullness of His being in the Son came as the Word came and dwelled in the flesh. Not to be 75% God and 25% man, or 75% man and 25% God, but to be fully God. But also at the same time to be fully human. Turning back to Isaiah chapter 53. This is what is described to us about the suffering servant in verse 2. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Isaiah describes the Messiah. He describes the suffering servant as a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. These were the same words that were used earlier in the book of Isaiah, actually several places, but one place in particular, to describe the nation of Israel as they were in Babylonian captivity. In chapter 37 and verse 27, to describe them as being small and fragile. It also describes that he had no form or no appearance that we would even want to look at him, that we would even desire him. These were the same words that were used to describe the beauty, the form, and the appearance of Rachel. We turn back to Genesis chapter 29 in verse 17. Leah was soft in the eyes. Rachel was beautiful. She had a beautiful form and a beautiful appearance. For a man like Jacob, who was concerned with the outward appearances, she was something beautiful to look at, something beautiful to hold on to, something beautiful to cling to, something beautiful to work an extra 7 years to obtain. But Jesus was none of that. The words that were being used here as well point us to the lineage that comes out of David, the messianic lineage that would arrive out of David, the branch of God, reminding us as well of the humble origins. Remember, David wasn't the best choice. It wasn't the first choice. Samuel came from one son to the next. Is this the one? No, he's not the one. How about this one? No, he's not the one. Well, is there anybody else? Yeah, well, there's a son over in the fields. He's keeping the sheep. God doesn't judge by outward appearance. And even Jesus himself, fragile, humble, and not desirable. All pointing us to the humanity of Jesus. All pointing to us to one who lived among men who didn't smell like royalty. He didn't have the stature of someone that you would think of as a military leader. But instead he was a human being. The humanity of Jesus comes out expressly throughout the Gospels as we see His physical limitations. Yes, there were days when Jesus was tired, even though He was one who could turn stones into bread and He could walk on water. He never performed miracles for His own human benefit. There were always signs to be able to express a truth that needed to be taught. And so yes, He even had His own human frailties. He experienced fatigue. There were moments in His life where He was hungry. There were moments whenever He was thirsty. He experienced a full range of human emotions. There were times that we see Him as being grieved in heart, angered because of the hearts of men. We see Him pouring out in anguish because He knows that the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed. We see Him weeping over the death of a friend. Now, Jesus was certainly not one who would always be of soul and spirit, but if ever we have such a celebration of His sorrow and grief, it is simply because it was through His sorrow and grief, as the arm of the Lord was upon Him, that we find our own salvation. Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 12, I believe, of the prophecies of Scripture that describe the sorrow and grief. Perhaps this passage helps us to understand, or helps us to be able to see how all the sorrows that Jesus could have ever experienced flooded upon Him at a single moment. Is it nothing to you? Lamentations 1:12. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow. It reminds us of the words of Isaiah chapter 52 and verses 13 and 14 as the suffering servant song begins, that he was marred more than any person that had ever lived. Is there any sorrow like my sorrow which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of His fierce anger? Is there any sorrow like my own? Will we ever be able to understand the sorrow and the grief that Jesus was experiencing at this moment, as He was preparing Himself to be arrested and then taken through trial and scourged and nailed upon the cross, and thus bearing all the sins of the entire world? Would we ever be able to understand it? The terror that must have flooded His mind in His humanity. If you would turn your Bibles over to Matthew chapter 26. Isaiah tells us that he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Later on in the chapter, in verse 10, it says that, "Yet for the will of the Lord, it was the will of the Lord, to crush him. He has put him to grief." Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 26, beginning with verse 36, and let's see Jesus as he steps into the garden. "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me.' And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.' And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So would you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, 'My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done.' And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again." We're going to stop there, and we're going to pick up there later tonight when we come back. Jesus was a man of sorrows. He was one that was acquainted with grief. Acquainted with grief. It quite literally made him sick. That's the meaning here, the word grief. It made him sick. Have you ever had something that happened to you, maybe the emotional thoughts that were running in your mind as you think about it? You think about the condition of somebody, or maybe you think about a situation that you're in and you think on it over and over, and it literally makes you sick. It turns your stomach. Jesus was grieved with sickness, knowing what was about to come upon him. The distress was so great, and agony was so severe, it literally brought him to the brink of death. When Jesus said those words that my soul is sorrowful even to the point of death, he wasn't speaking in hyperbole. If he survived the night in the garden, it was because of the will of God. It was because God would preserve him to go to the cross for your sins and for mine. Luke describes for us the agony that Jesus experienced as he comes into the garden. I believe it was Mark that describes how he falls down to his knees. Luke describes how he began to sweat as if it were great drops of blood. There is a true condition called hematidrosis, where when an individual is under such immense amount of stress, the capillaries under the skin begin to burst. Blood spills into the body, and the only way for that to escape is to escape through the sweat glands. But that only happens under the most intense stress. Whenever I was still a student at Freed-Hardeman, there was a social club, one of the larger social clubs, over 200 people in it. And the officers of the club, they were taking pictures, and they were all lying down on the ground at the bottom of a large embankment. And those in the club thought it would be funny if they dogpiled their officers. 200 people lying on top of 5 or 6 of the officers of that club. They came out at the bottom of that pile with blood-stained eyes. Vessels and capillaries were bursting under the intense stress that they were under, and that doesn't even compare to what Jesus was experiencing. From what I understand is that when a person experiences hematidrosis, that it causes the skin to be extremely tender to the touch. But now what would cause What would cause Jesus to experience such sorrow, such anguish, such agony, such grief? What would bring him to the point of sweating blood? Was it because of the fear of the cross? Was it because of the bitter and horrific treatment that he would experience at the hands of men? By Pilate and Herod and the Gentiles and even the Jews. Don't think for a moment that Jesus ever experienced any agony or anguish because of what men could do for him. This was the same Son of God who had told His disciples in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, "Do not fear him who is able to kill the body and is not able to kill the soul, but fear him who is able to kill both body and soul in hell." Jesus came into the garden, and when He began to offer up His prayers, He says, "My Father, let this cup pass from me." What was this cup that Jesus was experiencing? Looking into Old Testament prophecies and statements throughout the Old Testament, the cup was always a symbol of judgment. It was the fiery wrath of God. Remember the passage in Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 12? The day of God's fierce anger. Jesus had also told His disciples, this is Luke's parallel to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. In verses 4 and 5, He tells them, "Do not fear those who are able to kill the body, and afterward they can do nothing else. But rather be fearful of the one who has the power to cast both body and soul into hell." What is the cup? So a large crowd of individuals came, mixture of soldiers and priests, came to arrest Jesus, and Jesus willingly offered Himself unto them. It was Peter that reached into his sheath and drew out a sword. He tried to take off Malchus's head. And Jesus told him to put his sword back in his sheath. He said, "Do you not know that I must drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Yes, Jesus was about to go through trials. He was about to go through persecution. He was about to endure the scourging and the crucifixion. But the real sorrow, the real agony, was how the arm of the Lord would be stretched out against Him, upon Him. Returning to Isaiah chapter 53, when Jesus had entered into the garden, as soon as they reached the outer gates, He left His disciples there, except He took with Him Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John made up sort of this inner circle of His disciples, experiencing some of the greatest moments in Jesus' life, and they would experience this moment too. And so they came with Jesus further into the garden, and then Jesus told them to wait there. And do you remember what He told them to do? He gave them some work to do. You watch while I go over there and pray. And we're going to finish up on this point, but this is something that I think is so applicable to our very lives that we cannot miss it. Jesus went further to offer up a prayer, and when He prayed this prayer, He prayed it aloud for the benefit of His disciples. He didn't have to pray out loud, but why did He? For the benefit of the disciples, because He had told them, watch with me, listen to me. In Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, we find these words, and though this is much more general, much more broad than the way that we are applying it right now, it certainly fits. He was as one from whom men hide their faces. He was acquainted with grief, but Others have hid their faces. You know, I've talked with people before who said, I don't like going to the nursing home because it's so hurtful to see people in that condition. Or other individuals who experienced a great loss, I can't go to the funeral home because it just hurts me to see family suffering. Or perhaps others who said, I can't look upon this individual who is suffering with this disease and he looks so horrible and it just pains me to be able to look for him. And what do? They hide their faces. Now Luke chapter 22 and verse 45, Luke tells us that the disciples, now Matthew tells us that their eyes were heavy, but Luke goes a little bit deeper into what was going on in their hearts. They were sorrowed. They were filled. What was their sorrow about? Because they could see Jesus under the heavy weight of the arm of God. And in my opinion, that's all it is, in my judgment. If there was a reason for them to fall asleep at that moment, it's because they could not bear the agony and the sorrow themselves to watch Jesus suffer the way that He was suffering. It grieved them to see Him. And we see the irony of all ironies. Jesus, the Son of God, could not think of anything else He would rather do than to get down upon His knees and pray. And then the disciples, in their humanity, felt no need to do the same. It's interesting that the three disciples that were with Jesus were the same three disciples that we see on the mount that we call the Mount of Transfiguration. It was on that mount that when Peter, James, and John woke up, they saw Jesus and Elijah and Moses. And they thought it was so wonderful for them to be able to be there that let's build a tabernacle, one for each of them, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then you know the scene. From the sky came the words when God spoke from heaven above, "This is my Son, listen to Him." And yet we come to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus is on His knees communing as the Son of God with the Father and with the Holy Spirit. And after being told by Jesus to watch with me, they did not listen to Him. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. Peter said, if everybody deserts you, I will never desert you. His spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak. And he hid himself from the grief and the sorrow that Jesus was experiencing. Of all the prayers that Jesus offered in His life, there's only one time whenever He addresses God as God. John mentioned it this morning in his comments. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Every prayer that is recorded by Jesus, He always addresses the Father as such. Father. But of all the prayers that Jesus offered, there is only one in which He addresses Him not as God, not as Father, but as my Father. Mark even says that he goes to prayer saying, "Abba, Father, I know that all things are possible with you." No other time in the life of Jesus is Jesus shown as being so intimately tied together with the Father above. And though in His humanity and His sorrow, He does not... He's not desiring for all of that to come upon His humanity. But He knows that He must. He knows that He must endure it. He must be resolved. And if perhaps there was ever a time in which the Spirit strengthened Him more than any other time, it was at this moment as He uttered the words, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus was going to honor an eternal covenant made between the Godhead since before the world even began. Jesus would endure the heavy, judging, delivering arm of God for you and for me. When Jesus offered the prayer, He offered it for His disciples. And as that story is recorded for us, I believe it was recorded for our benefit. About to approach Jesus were those who gloried in their self-esteem. But what we find in the disciples are those who were waiting in their self-defeat. Let me tell you something this morning. It is no greater thing to wallow in your self-defeat than it is for others to swim in their self-victory, in their self-esteem. Jesus went to the cross because your arm isn't strong enough. He also went to the cross because your spirits are low enough. All we like sheep have gone astray. Some to think too highly of themselves, others to think too lowly of themselves. But as He would eventually come to the cross, God laid upon Him the iniquity of us all. Is that the suffering servant that you believe in, that you trust in? This morning, as we sing the song of invitation, if your desire is to surrender to the arm of the Lord, that you might be upheld by His righteous right arm, we invite you to surrender yourself, saying, I fully trust in Jesus. I trust in His atoning work, and I will place all of my dependence upon what Jesus did upon the cross for me. And having changed my life, giving up the ways of the world, hating my life in this world, and confessing that I cannot do it on my own, that I must do it by Jesus, the Son of God, you can surrender yourself in the occasion of your immersion, that the atoning work of the cross can be applied to you then. And we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Holy words,
This has been It Is Written, presented by the Glendale Road Church of Christ. We welcome your visits and communications at any time.
resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.